The church didn't just take your community when it rejected you. It took your voice. Not your speaking voice, something deeper than that. The voice you used to bring to God at 2 a.m., the one that wasn't edited, wasn't rehearsed, wasn't trying to sound spiritual enough. That voice went quiet. You probably noticed it slowly at first. You'd sit down to pray and the words would come out different, cleaner, more careful, like you were filling out a form instead of talking to someone who loves you. And underneath the careful words, a question you couldn't fully silence. What if God agrees with what they said about me? That question right there is the wound no one talks about. Church rejection doesn't just wound your relationships with people. It poisons the one relationship that was supposed to be untouchable. It makes you perform in God's presence the same way you performed in theirs, hoping you're acceptable enough, hoping this time you won't be sent away. If you've been going through the motions of prayer ever since, doing it out of discipline, not out of desire, I need you to hear something before we go any further. There is a prayer in Scripture that most churches never teach, not because it's complicated, because it sounds too raw, too undone, too much like someone who hasn't fixed themselves yet. And that's exactly why it was written for you. It's called the prayer of lament, and it's not for the spiritually advanced, it's for the spiritually silenced. Here's what you need to understand right now before we go any deeper. Every day you pray from behind the wall that church rejection built, performing, editing, apologizing to God for still being wounded, is another day your true voice stays buried. The healing you are waiting for cannot reach you through a version of yourself you're presenting. It can only reach the real you. And right now, that real version of you has been sealed off by a wound that's still pretending to be fine in front of God. Here's what most teachings on healing from church hurt completely skip over. They tell you to forgive, they tell you to find a new community, they tell you to trust God's plan. But almost no one addresses what happens inside the prayer room after rejection. Because here's what happened there. The same voice that told you that you weren't enough, too damaged, too messy, too much of a spiritual liability, that voice followed you into your conversations with God. You stopped bringing the real prayers. You started bringing the prayers you thought were appropriate for someone in your position, someone who had been rejected, someone who needed to prove they were still worth God's attention. The Bible calls this fig leaf theology. It started in a garden when two people who felt exposed decided to cover themselves before approaching God. The prayer of lament is the complete opposite of that. It is the prayer that says, I am not covering myself before I come to you. I'm coming exactly as I am, wounded, angry, confused, and still here. Now I want to show you something that will change how you think about prayer entirely. Of the 150 Psalms in the Bible, the prayer book of the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, roughly 1/3 are prayers of lament, not declarations of faith, not anthems of praise, prayers of pain, confusion, and honest complaint brought directly to God. Psalm 13, How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Lamentations 3, He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. These weren't written by people who were spiritually weak. They were written by people who were spiritually honest. And here's what's critical. Every single person who prayed lament in Scripture came out of it with a deeper relationship with God, not a damaged one. Because lament isn't the prayer of someone who has lost their faith. It's the prayer of someone who trusts God enough to bring their actual feelings into the room. Think about what that means for your prayer life after church hurt specifically. The voices from that rejection told you that you were too complicated, too much of a burden, too far from what God wanted. They communicated, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through silence and exclusion, that certain versions of you were not acceptable. So you learned to manage what you brought to God. But lament blows that entire system apart. Because lament says, if I can be this honest with God, then who I truly am is acceptable before Him. That is not a minor emotional comfort. That is identity restoration happening in real time. Here's the turn that changes everything. We've been taught in most churches that prayer is how we bring our best selves to God. What if the opposite is true? What if prayer, true biblical prayer, is how God receives the self that everyone else rejected? The Psalms don't describe a God who becomes more comfortable with you when you clean up your language. They describe a God who leans in when the language gets raw. The most intimate moments in Scripture are not the polished prayers. They're the broken ones, Job arguing with God from a garbage heap, Jeremiah cursing the day he was born, Jesus crying out in Aramaic that God had abandoned him. The broken voice was always the one God answered. So when church rejection silenced you before God, when it made you feel that your truest self was too damaged to be heard, it was lying to you about the very nature of prayer itself. And I understand why that's difficult to receive. Because you didn't just feel rejected by people. On some level, you felt rejected by the institution that was supposed to represent God. And when God's institution turns you away, the wound isn't just relational, it's theological. Part of you began to wonder whether God agreed with their verdict about you. That's the wound that makes normal prayer feel impossible. You can't simply pray your way through it using the same kind of prayer that stopped working. You need a different kind of prayer, one that was specifically designed for people who feel unheard, not just by the church, but by God Himself. And until you pray that prayer, something quietly devastating happens. You keep looking for your identity in all the places the church once provided it, and finding only the echo of their rejection. You read about being loved by God and feel strangely unmoved. You hear about belonging and feel further away than before, not because God isn't speaking, but because the wound is sitting between you and the ability to receive what He's saying. The silence isn't spiritual indifference, it's damage, and damage needs a specific kind of care. Here are the 5 movements of the prayer of lament. This is the hidden framework woven through the Psalms, through Lamentations, through Job, and it's the same framework that begins to dismantle what church rejection built inside you. First, honest address. Come to God not as the acceptable version of yourself, but as the person who is actually sitting in the room right now. Say His name. Then say, I need you to hear what I haven't been able to say. Second, the complaint. Name what happened, not the theologized version, not I experienced a trial, but the human version. They told me I wasn't enough. They made me feel like a burden. I lost my community and I don't understand why you allowed it. God does not need you to protect His feelings. He already knows what happened. He's waiting for you to say it out loud, because the moment you say it to God instead of burying it, it stops defining you from the inside. Third, the specific request. Ask precisely. Not a general, restore me, Lord, something real, restore my voice. Help me know who I am when I'm not in their building. Let me feel that my prayers are actually heard. Specificity in prayer is an act of faith. Vague prayers are the prayers of someone not quite sure God is listening. Fourth, trust in character. This is not forced positivity. It's not pretending the wound isn't real. It's saying, I don't understand what happened, but I know who you are. And who you are doesn't change based on what they decided about me. This is where identity restoration begins to take root. Because you are anchoring your sense of self not in what a church declared about you, but in what God has never stopped believing about you. Fifth, a single true moment of gratitude, not performed, not manufactured, just one real thing. Thank you that I can still come here. Thank you that I'm still here. That gratitude, however small it feels, is proof that the wound hasn't killed your voice. It's just been waiting for permission to speak. Every biblical figure who prayed lament came out of it with an expanded capacity, not a diminished one. David prayed lament while being hunted by Saul. He became king. Job prayed lament from absolute devastation. God called him a man of integrity. Jeremiah wept through entire books of Scripture. He became one of the most quoted voices in all of redemptive history. Church rejection was designed, consciously or not, to make you smaller, to make you question whether your voice, your story, your presence mattered in the kingdom. The prayer of lament says something different. It says, "My voice is so real, so significant, so worthy of being heard that I'm bringing the rawest version of it directly to God." That prayer doesn't just heal you. It restores you to the identity that was always yours, the one no institution was ever given the authority to take. Here's what I want you to carry with you from this. The church rejected a version of you they decided was too much or not enough. But lament prayer reveals a truth they never had the right to contradict. You were never required to be acceptable before coming to God. You were simply required to come. And if you've been wondering whether God is still listening after everything that happened inside that building, He hasn't moved. He's been waiting for you to stop performing. The moment you do, the voice you thought was gone will find its way back, not as the person the church needed you to be, as the person God has always known you are.